we're talking about exposure management, so maybe it's best to kind of start with just how you define this concept, this idea of
Sure.
exposure management.
So I think about exposure management as the identification and validation of weaknesses in an environment. And that can be both people, it can be a process dependency, and then primarily it's technical in the space that we're talking about. It's finding places where either the architecture is weakly designed or the configurations aren't up to what we would consider to be a hardened standard, but it's attempting to provide data to decision makers on how to remediate risk within the environment.
And I imagine this is kind of just an evolution beyond software vulnerabilities,
Sure.
beyond firmware vulnerabilities.
And so software and firmware is one place. The other place where we're focusing a lot now is the design of the network of the environments that we're working with. So a lot of operations groups are building things for uptime, production maintenance, and they're not necessarily thinking through some of the security considerations that they might should. As they're designing these networks, they want them to be available and working. And sometimes that kind of comes to head with what the security group may want to do with that network. So there's a partnership that has to start to be created between security and operations. So both sides understand what their requirements are and can work to what's the right fit for what they're manufacturing, what the process is automating, but making sure that security has a place at the table and can help protect that. Because you can be up for years and years and years, and that first event that takes place that takes you offline, you've just spent all of that good credit that you've got for the last 2 years in the remediation of whatever activity took place.
Yeah, I brought up the software and firmware vulnerabilities because I would imagine that that's been a primary risk criteria. And I would imagine that's a mistake given all the connectivity, and I mean, it's important, but
It is, and there's still a lot of value in identifying places where firmware and configuration is vulnerable.
Sure.
Whether it's firmware that's out of date and has a number of known known vulnerabilities that people can execute against, but I think that can't be the only place, right? There needs to be a holistic view of how do we find or identify what the vulnerability is, and how do we contextualize the risk? There are a number of places where you may have a system that is old and out of date, but it's in an isolated part of the network, or the process that it's automating is a nice to have, or it's built in triplicate, and that lowers the risk of it, right? And being able to foster a common language between the various groups that have a hand in protecting whatever it is that we're talking about protecting is very important, because security may come in, very loud and very noisy and say, we've got 200, 9.5 plus vulnerabilities in the environment. What are we going to do? And they're going to put forward a plan that's going to require months of remediation time, and operations at the end of the day is going to go, we can't do that. So we need to arm both security professionals that we're working with and the operations professionals to really get a good idea of how do we make that risk statement for the environment that we're dealing with make sense for both sides, and then build a plan to work through, either upgrade because we're going to get rid of that firmware version and that's going to get rid of the risk, or we can't do that right now. How can we compensate for leaving that in place because we have 2 more years of 24/7 process that we need to go through before we're going to have downtime. And then making sure that security has a seat at that table when they do go through these major upgrades for continuous manufacture, so that those requirements can be baked into a new rollout or an upgrade that's taking place.
I'm glad you brought up the high CVSS score, because not every vulnerability applies to every environment. There's not an exploit for every vulnerability, so it's a little more complex than just that. The score.
There's a lot of nuance there, and understanding those nuances and building that partnership's important, so that when security looks straight at that score, and says, here's what it is. Operations has the glossary to go, but it's not something that we depend on.
Sure.
Or we've isolated it. Here's the way that we're going to manage that until we can fix it.
In terms of the OT side of the house, are there certain types of OT data that tell kind of the best story about an organization's exposures? What do you see there?
Absolutely. So one of the large places that we'll start with is age, right? Understanding, and when I'll say asset management, but I'll say capital A asset management. So it's the system that you've built, the process that you're automating. Depending on what its life cycle is, we may need to run it for 10 years. So understanding and starting to figure out, okay, what is the age of the devices that we're talking about? What does their replacement life cycle look like? Are we funded to do that is important. The other data that's a little bit more challenging, because here's where you have oftentimes both an IT or infrastructure component and OT, is how's the network designed? So coming up with the zones and the conduits and the communication pathways between certain zones in your shop floor becomes really important, because that'll start telling me, okay, well, these 17 devices only talk to one another, and there's only one of them that's pushing data outside of the environment. So we can start to understand where we can put protection layers in.
Yeah.
And that will, without necessarily disrupting anything, we can start putting control around the access to those devices, and that'll help remediate or at least lower that score's effect on the environment and how it's operated.
What are some of those capabilities that need to be in place to kind of discover the riskiest exposures at least?
So some form of OT aware visibility is important. So, there's a number of folks that are doing it now, but having that as a foundational capability to go out and discover all your assets. We're still working with clients that, may only know about 30% of their assets. So now you have a 70% that's unknown.
Yeah.
And that's a huge driver. Understanding the network management and some of the ways that security tools are being integrated into that network to figure out whether or not you have the capabilities placed in the right, that they're in the place that they need to be to gather the data that we need to start making decisions is important. And then one of the last things is having well-defined processes between all of the groups that are involved in this, so that they have clear responsibility when things happen. I'm going to do this, you're going to do this, we're going to partner to achieve this. That's not something that you can buy and install in your network. It's a culture change that needs to take place, where the mission is fix the problem, and everyone is aligned to that mission, so that when events do occur, people know what their role is and can understand what the execution is.
Bringing a factory floor back online is a lot different than re-imaging a server or whatever.
It is, and you bring an outage up, and that really requires close coordination, and there needs to be a sense that we're all trying to get to the same objective. And oftentimes we see groups that will come in with competing priorities, and making sure that those priorities are aligned properly will speed the recovery of the situation, and it engenders a feeling of community between the groups there. So that, okay, yes, we had to deprioritize the security aspect for the last 24 hours because we needed to get back online, but we're going to spend the next couple of weeks meeting and figuring out, okay, what happened, how can we prevent this from happening again, and what can we do to start identifying those things earlier so that it doesn't happen.
What does it mean to you to operationalize OT data, within the context of cybersecurity?
I like this question. It's a conversation that I really want to get started right now. I think that a majority of industry verticals have had enough time in the space to think about it. And we, for 10 years, we're like, go find your assets. Well, we found a lot of them, and they're producing an enormous amount of relevant data. And you bring up security. Security is kind of in that first shell, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to want a lot of the technical specifications and data that's coming out of this. But there are a number of other groups that can benefit from getting access to that information. Budgetary and capital planning, understanding, what's the debt that we're dealing with, and how do we make sure that we account for the cost that it's going to be to start achieving some of the objectives that we've set out. Demand and financial planning, like understanding the activity within an OT network to know where your critical zones of manufacture are. Okay, maybe I've got 15 plants that do the same thing, but this one's always 95% busy, and this one only comes online when we need a little bit of extra help. Well, let's focus on making sure that what we know is going to operate all the time, every day, is protected correctly. And define the architectures and define the security requirements that it fits the whole thing. But you know, if I only have X number of dollars to invest this year, you can start targeting and pinpointing where you're going to see upgrades provide the best value.
Right. That's huge to, as far as where you deploy detection and where you segment things.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Let's talk about the OT attack surface, for example. I'm sure with just this hyper connectivity we're seeing, it's dramatically changed in the last 5 years or whatever time period. Just talk about that a little bit.
It is. I think we're getting very good at figuring out what the answer is for traditional control system and automation environments. The challenge now is the preponderance of IoT sensors that are getting dropped onto the plant floor because it's easy.
Yeah.
You just throw them on a Wi-Fi network, build private 5G, they connect in. The concerns around that is maybe someone isn't validating the device architecture all the way through. And we didn't know that, oh, well, not only is it connected to our Wi-Fi network on the shop floor, but it also has a cell antenna that's built in so that it can provide the data enrichment that they promised, right? You know, the vendor came to you and said, we'll put this sensor, in your facility, we'll be able to evaluate the way that you're doing things, and we'll give you, real-time insights on how you can make your process better. But they're doing that by opening up connectivity that you may not be aware of, security may not be aware of, and understanding how do you make sure that you're zoning those properly. We're seeing a lot of places where there's already space on the automation network. These are sensors. It's an automation-like device. We'll just put it in the same place. Maybe that's not right. Maybe it's defining a new zone, making sure that the sensors have the visibility that they need, but they don't have any capacity to connect back into the same networks where your primary control systems are, and that they don't, if something happens with them, because a lot of these sensors are brand new. They were, it's 6 months ago, we've just got the product going, we're going to market, we want to show our value to companies, and they're not going through the security life cycle that they need to make sure that they're not introducing risk into your environment. So we need to be forward thinking and make sure that we're putting those sensors and those other devices and that hyper converged connectivity into a place where it doesn't have the potential to disrupt activities.
So just kind of as we start to wrap up, I wanted to ask you about kind of the controls that matter most. And I know you're going to say it depends, but I'm thinking access controls, remote access, vulnerability management, et cetera. Just all of this, how does it roll into exposure management? What matters most?
So network segmentation is huge. We're still going through a massive evolution of making sure that control systems are removed from the corporate network. I'm actively engaged in a number of projects that are working towards that end. Let's make sure that the enterprise doesn't have access to the shop floor unless they need it. The next side of it is, if they need that access, how do we provide them that data?
Right.
Do we allow remote connectivity down to the shop floor from folks that aren't necessarily part of the controls group? Or do we work on doing data replication to a safe space where, okay, you need the data, we'll provide an offline copy of it that's a few seconds old that you can do all the data mining that you need to continue to do your job. Remote access for both internal employees and then external vendors is huge, and those should be treated differently, right? So if you're an internal employee, you may go through your own system, and there's, I would say, more flexible access controls. But if you have a vendor that's coming onto the shop floor, there's no reason why they should have access to anything other than the devices that they're obligated to support. And making sure that we have processes and technology in place to enforce that is critical. The other thing, and it's a people capability, but defining and practicing continuity and incident response exercises. knowing and getting the entire organization plus the supporting vendors on the same page with what happens if, and everyone knows how to react and everyone knows their role, so that we can work through and make sure that it's as reliable as possible, and when something does happen we can recover quickly is very important. And that has, yes, there's technology enablers. You can find process engines that will help you build that out, but it really comes down to a practice makes perfect kind of thing, where people are aware of the risk that's in the environment,
Yeah.
and that they understand where those plans are, and they've exercised with them a couple of times, so that if that day arises, it's something that's practiced, and it's I know what I'm supposed to do, and I go do it.
Right.
And that way we make sure that we protect the business, we make sure we protect the people, because a lot of the places that we are, it's a dangerous environment. And if you don't understand the human safety aspect of it, you can then have something that's technology focused become people focused, and that opens up a whole different level of risk definition if all of a sudden you have injuries or something like that. And then as soon as that happens, people are going to forget. So you want to make sure that you stay safe and you can continue to execute the plan that you've developed without adding in a distraction that someone's hurt. We need to make sure that we help them out.